are battles in life you were never meant to fight. Struggles that were never yours to carry. Burdens that were never placed on your shoulders by God. And yet you keep fighting, pushing, striving, as if the weight of the world rests in your hands alone. But I am here to tell you today, there is a greater power at work, a force that goes beyond human understanding. There is a God who fights for you. Look around this world and you'll see people worn out, broken down and defeated because they keep stepping into battles that belong to God. They let fear drive them, pride control them, and doubt consume them. But the Bible says the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Exodus 14:14. Maybe today you're in the middle of a war you don't know how to win. Maybe you're struggling with a sickness the doctors can't explain. Maybe your marriage is falling apart, your finances are drained, or your enemies are closing in. You've tried everything, you've prayed, you've planned, and still the battle rages on. But hear me, some wars are not won by strength, some battles are not conquered by strategy, some victories come only when you step back and let God take control. Remember David standing before a giant named Goliath. He was just a boy. No armor, no sword, no army behind him. And yet he did not back down in fear. He stood firm and declared, "The battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." 1 Samuel 17:47. And with a single stone, God brought down the giant. I think of Jehoshaphat, surrounded by 3 great armies, outnumbered, outmatched, with no way to win. But instead of drawing his sword, he fell to his knees. He cried out to God, and God answered. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours, but God's. 2 Chronicles 20:15. And without lifting a single weapon, God sent confusion into the enemy's camp, and they destroyed themselves. My friend, what battle are you fighting today that you need to surrender? What weight are you carrying that God never intended for you to bear? If you are struggling, if you are weary, if you are ready to give up, don't. Do not let the enemy tell you that it's over. Do not believe the lie that God has forgotten you. Do not fall into the trap of thinking you must fight alone. Because when you step back and trust in Him, God steps in and does what only He can do. I've seen it in my own life. People have come against me, doors have closed, storms have raged, and just when it seemed like all hope was lost, God moved. He made a way where there was no way. He turned the enemy's weapons into stepping stones for my destiny. He lifted me up when the world tried to tear me down, and He will do the same for you. Listen to me. You are not the only enemy that can help stop this battle is love. Chains will break. Doors will open. The enemy will flee. The Bible prophesies that evil will be banished. Or lay the hands the moment you bleed. The last false chains will break. Doors will open. The enemy will flee. Because no enemy can stand against the Almighty. No force of darkness can overpower His light. No weapon formed against you shall prosper when God is fighting for you. So today, make a decision, lay it down, give it to Him, and stand firm in faith. The battle is not yours, it is the Lord's. And He has already won. There are battles in life that were never meant for you to fight. You struggle, you push, you exhaust yourself, trying to fix things, trying to force outcomes, trying to make everything work. But what if the very thing you're fighting isn't yours to handle? What if the burden you're carrying was never placed on your shoulders by God? Too many people spend their lives battling problems they were meant to release. They fight against closed doors, against people who don't support them, against circumstances beyond their control. They lose sleep over things they can't change, worry about situations that are out of their hands, and waste energy fighting battles they were never equipped to win. But the truth is, not every battle requires your strength. Some battles demand your surrender. Some battles require you to let go and trust that God knows what He's doing. Think of a child trying to carry a load too heavy for them. The father reaches out and says, "Let me take it," but the child insists, struggling, stumbling, nearly collapsing under the weight. And all the while the father stands there, ready, willing, strong enough to carry it with ease. That is exactly what happens when you refuse to give your battles to God. He is waiting. His hands are open. His strength is unlimited. Yet so often we hold on, convinced that we must figure it out alone. Moses stood before the Red Sea with an army chasing him from behind. The people panicked, the situation looked impossible, but God spoke. "The Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still." Moses could have tried to build boats, to fight back, to run, but instead he obeyed. He stepped aside, lifted his staff, and God parted the sea. Right now, there may be battles in your life that feel overwhelming. You've done everything you know how to do, and still nothing changes. It's time to recognize that some battles are beyond your ability. Some fights require faith, not force. Some victories come only when you step aside and allow God to take over. The moment you release it, the moment you trust Him, you will see Him move in ways you never imagined. God fights for those who trust Him. That is not just a comforting thought, it is a divine promise. Time and time again, the Bible shows that when people place their trust in God, He stepped in and did what no human power could accomplish. He is not distant, He is not indifferent, and He is not silent. He is a warrior, a defender, a protector of His people. The battle you are facing today may seem impossible, but you are not fighting alone. When you put your trust in Him, you invite the Almighty to take over. In Exodus 14:14, the Israelites stood trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's advancing army. Fear gripped their hearts. They thought their story was over, but Moses spoke these words, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Notice what was required, not frantic effort, not desperate planning, not fighting back in their own strength, but simply trust. And as they placed their faith in God, the waters parted, and they walked through on dry ground. What seemed like a dead end became a doorway to deliverance. Trusting God does not mean sitting idly by, doing nothing. It means positioning yourself in faith, refusing to let fear drive your actions, and believing that God is in control even when you cannot see the outcome. It means standing firm when everything in you wants to run. It means praising Him in the storm, even before you see the victory. It means letting go of anxiety and stepping into the peace that comes from knowing the battle is in His hands. Throughout history, those who trusted God saw His power in ways that defied logic. Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, yet he trusted God and not a single lion touched him. The 3 Hebrew boys stood in the fiery furnace, yet because they refused to bow, they walked out unharmed. Paul and Silas were locked in a prison cell, beaten and chained, yet they worshiped. And God shook the foundations of that prison and set them free. The same God who fought for them is the God who fights for you. If you trust Him, He will make a way where there is no way. He will move the mountains that stand in front of you. He will silence the enemy, part the waters and lead you to victory in his perfect time. Victory comes through surrender, not struggle. That is the paradox of faith. The world teaches that to win you must fight harder, push further, and take control. But in God's kingdom, the greatest victories come not by force, but by faith. Not by striving, but by surrendering. Too often people wear themselves out trying to fix what only God can fix. They run in circles trying to manipulate outcomes, control situations, and force things to happen. But the more they struggle, the more they seek. The breakthrough they long for never comes because they are still holding on instead of letting go. God never called you to fight every battle in your own strength. He never intended for you to carry burdens that are too heavy for you. When Peter walked on water, he did the impossible as long as his eyes were on Jesus. The moment he looked at the wind and waves, fear took over, and he began to sink. He struggled, but his struggle only pulled him down. It was not until he surrendered and cried out, "Lord, save me," that Jesus reached out and lifted him up. That is what surrender looks like. Not giving up, but giving over. Not quitting, but shifting the weight from your hands into God's hands. There was a time when Jacob wrestled with God all night, refusing to let go. He had spent years fighting for blessings, fighting for approval, fighting to be in control. But God touched his hip, and in that moment Jacob realized he could not win by struggling. He had to surrender, and when he did, God changed his name from Jacob to Israel, from deceiver to a man who prevailed with God. His greatest victory came when he finally stopped fighting and let God take over. Abraham received a promise that he would be the father of many nations, but years passed and nothing happened. So he and Sarah tried to force the promise by their own efforts, and it led to heartache. But when they finally surrendered, trusting God's timing instead of their own, Isaac was born, the child of promise. The victory you seek will not come by human effort alone. The greatest breakthroughs happen when you stop wrestling and start resting in God. The moment you surrender your fears, your plans, your battles, he steps in and does what you could never do on your own. David defeated Goliath because he trusted God. That battle was never about strength, skill, or strategy. It was not won by weapons or numbers. It was won by faith. David was just a shepherd boy, too young to be a soldier, too small to wear the king's armor, too inexperienced to lead an army. By every human measure, he was unqualified to fight a warrior like Goliath. But God does not choose based on human standards. He does not need the strongest, the smartest, or the most powerful. He needs the one who is willing to trust him completely. For 40 days, Goliath stood in the valley, mocking Israel, taunting the armies of God. Every soldier, including King Saul, was terrified. They saw Goliath's size, his armor, his weapons, and they believed the battle was already lost. But when David arrived, he did not see an undefeatable giant. He saw a powerless enemy standing against the living God. He did not hesitate. He did not let fear creep in. He stood before Goliath and declared, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." 1 Samuel 17:45. That is what trust looks like. He did not put his confidence in weapons or armor. He did not rely on his own strength. He placed his faith entirely in God, knowing that the battle belonged to him. And with just a single stone, Goliath fell. David's victory was not about his aims. It was about his faith. Had he relied on his own ability, he would have lost. But he understood that when God is on your side, the impossible becomes possible. He knew that no enemy, no matter how big, could stand against the power of God. Many people today face their own Goliaths, giants of fear, doubt, sickness, financial struggles, and broken relationships. They stand frozen, overwhelmed by the size of the battle in front of them. But the same God who gave David victory is the God who fights for you. When you stop looking at how big the problem is and start looking at how big your God is, everything changes. The enemy loses its power. The fear loses its grip. And the moment you step forward in faith, God steps in and does what no human effort could accomplish. Letting go is not weakness, it's wisdom. The world tells you to fight harder, to push through, to take control of every situation. Surrender is often seen as failure, as giving up, as a sign of weakness. But in God's kingdom, surrender is not defeat. It is the key to victory. It is not about quitting, but about shifting the battle from your hands into God's hands. When you insist on carrying the weight alone, you limit yourself to your own strength. But when you release it to God, you invite His unlimited power into your situation. Too many people are exhausted, burdened by battles they were never meant to fight. They worry about things beyond their control, stressing over outcomes they cannot change. They try to force doors open, fix people who refuse to change, and hold on to situations that God is asking them to release. But the more they fight, the more frustrated they become. The more they struggle, the more stuck they feel. The weight of it all begins to crush them, not because God has abandoned them, but because they refuse to let go. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," Matthew 11:28. That is not just an invitation, it is a divine strategy for victory. Rest does not come from figuring everything out. Peace does not come from controlling every detail. True freedom comes when you place it all in God's hands and trust that He knows what He is doing. Abraham learned this the hard way. God promised him a son, but when years passed with no child, he and Sarah took matters into their own hands. They tried to force the promise by having a child through Hagar, but their plan only brought pain and division. It was not until they let go, until they surrendered to God's timing, that Isaac, the child of promise, was born. Whatever you are holding on to today, fear, worry, control, God is calling you to release it. The moment you stop striving and start trusting, He moves. The moment you let go of your plan, He reveals His. And when God takes over, He does more in a moment than you could do in a lifetime. Surrender is not losing. It is stepping into a victory that was never yours to win alone. God turns obstacles into opportunities. What looks like a dead end, a failure, or an impossible situation is often the very thing He will use to lead you into something greater. Too often, people see obstacles as signs to quit, as proof that things are not working out. They grow frustrated, discouraged, and overwhelmed when doors close, when setbacks happen, when life does not go as planned. But what if the very thing standing in your way is the setup for something far beyond what you imagined? What if the problem you are facing is not blocking you, it is preparing you? Joseph was given a dream that he would be a ruler, but his journey to that destiny was nothing like he expected. He was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and locked in prison for years. From the outside, it looked like everything was going wrong. Every step seemed to take him further from his dream. But what seemed like an obstacle was actually the path to his purpose. If his brothers had not betrayed him, he would not have ended up in Egypt. If he had not been falsely accused, he would not have been in prison at the right time to interpret Pharaoh's dream. And if he had not been in prison, he would not have been promoted to the highest position in Egypt. What the enemy meant for harm, God turned for good. The pit was not the end, it was the beginning. The prison was not his final destination, it was a passage to the palace. Every obstacle, every hardship, every setback was used by God to position Joseph for his destiny. Moses faced an impossible obstacle at the Red Sea. The enemy was closing in, the people were panicking, and there was nowhere to go. But what seemed like a trap became the place where God displayed his power. The sea that stood in their way was the very thing God used to destroy their enemies. Right now, you may be facing something that feels impossible. A closed door, a painful loss, a situation that does not make sense. But what if this is not a defeat? What if this is the very thing God will use to take you where you were meant to be? What looks like an obstacle today may be the very opportunity God is using to lead you into your purpose. Blind Bartimaeus sat by the roadside begging, unable to see but able to believe. When he heard that Jesus was passing by, he did not stay silent. He cried out, refusing to be ignored. The crowd told him to be quiet, but he shouted louder. Jesus stopped, called him forward, and said, "Your faith has healed you." Mark 10:52. The miracle was not in the moment Jesus spoke. It was in the moment Bartimaeus believed. Faith moves mountains, but it does not always happen the way we expect. The Israelites walked around Jericho for 7 days, seeing no change in the walls. Naaman had to dip in the river 7 times before his leprosy disappeared. Peter had to step out of the boat before he could walk on water. Faith often requires action before the answer appears. So many people wait to see the miracle before they believe, but God calls us to believe before we see. He calls us to step out, to trust him when there is no evidence, to move forward when nothing has changed yet. When you activate faith, you activate God's power. When you trust him beyond what makes sense, you position yourself for the supernatural. And when faith is in motion, miracles become inevitable, because nothing is impossible for the one who holds all things in his hands. The battles you face are not yours to fight alone. The struggles, the fears, the impossibilities, God never intended for you to carry them in your own strength. Time and time again, his word shows that victory comes not by human effort, but by faith, surrender, and trust in him. The Red Sea parted not because of Moses' strength, but because God fought for his people. David defeated Goliath not with armor or skill, but with confidence in the Lord. Jehoshaphat's enemies destroyed themselves, not because of military strategy, but because of worship. Over and over, God proves that when you step back and allow him to take over, he moves in ways beyond what you could imagine. There will be moments when fear tells you to fight harder, to panic, to take control. But the greatest act of faith is often surrender. To trust that God sees what you cannot see, that he knows what you do not know, and that his timing is perfect. The obstacles in front of you are not there to defeat you. They are there to develop you, to prepare you, and to display God's power in your life. What looks like a dead end is often the setup for a miracle. What seems impossible is just an opportunity for God to do the extraordinary. Faith activates miracles. Surrender invites victory. Trust releases God's power. When you stop trying to fight battles that belong to him, you will see him move in ways that leave no doubt. It was never by your might, never by your power, but by his Spirit. He is the God who parts seas, who brings down giants, who turns obstacles into opportunities. And he is still the same today.